you guys hear me? Yes, yes. Okay, everybody please be seated so we can begin.
We can sort of hear you.
You can sort of hear me.
You're a little faint. You have to speak right into it.
Right into it.
That's it.
Yes.
You're taller than
I am.
Don't worry, I'll play.
All right.
We have a special guest speaker today, and I've asked John to come and introduce him. This was his idea.
Well, as I explained to Jackie, Mary and Martha. I'm the Mary, I did nothing. She's the Martha who did all the work. So really, all the thanks goes to Martha. The way this came about, as it happened, both Rich and I were separately taking a crossing, an Atlantic crossing on the Queen Mary 2 a few months ago, which is great, by the way. I highly recommend it. And on the Queen Mary 2, they have daily activities, all kinds of things going on. And Rich was a featured speaker 4 times, I think. And I went to each one of them. And then on the boat, they have closed circuit TV. So during that day, they would replay his talks. And I'd go back to the room and I'd rewatch his talks and take notes. They're on the 4 books that you've written so far. One is on the prophets, another one is on the Arius Athanasius controversy, a third is on the scientific revolution of the 1200s, where the church really fostered science and then got ossified. And he's now working on a 4th book, which will be the end times. So I keep going to Amazon, trying to click on the end time book. It's not ready yet. In any case, so that's, and Rich is going to, I think, you know, you went to Harvard College and law school, a Rhodes Scholar, right? And then you taught law, and he taught conflict resolution. And you had a sabbatical in France, I think, one summer, 1 year. You rented a house from a French professor, and you had to pay extra to use his library, right? Am I getting this right? And he paid extra to use the library. And in the library were books on the Arius Athanasius conflict, and that got him into thinking about conflict resolution in the context of religious history and religious conflicts. And with that introduction, he will now be speaking. What would Isaiah and Jeremiah say given the current situation in the Middle East today? Right?
Right.
Good. Richard Scott.
Great to see you again on dry land.
Yeah.
And thank you all for inviting me. Thank you to Norman especially for putting this together. I'm very happy to be here. I was going to show you some pictures. I'm going to steal this but there's a computer glitch, so we're not going to have pictures. But it'll be like the old days, before everybody wanted pictures. So you're going to get words. I wanted also to show you that this talk was mainly based on this book called Thus Saith the Lord, the Revolutionary Moral Vision of Isaiah and Jeremiah. My publisher, which was, in this case, was Harcourt, insisted they liked the Thus Saith the Lord title. And they said, if we're going to write about prophets, it should be Thus Saith the Lord. Well, what I wanted to call it was Empire and Ethics, then with a subtitle about Isaiah and Jeremiah. But for some reason they didn't like that, or they didn't think it would sell. Well, this one didn't sell too well either, because of the title. It was shelved with the Bible. Right? And people wanted the Bible. They bought the Bible, not this. So I'm happy to have a chance to tell you about some of these ideas in a context which is no fun to talk about at all. genocide. And we'll come back to that at the end of my talk. And talk about what some of the current applications might be of the doctrines that I'm going to talk about. But I think it will also, at that point, be pretty clear what some of the applications are. The fascinating thing about the prophets are endlessly interesting. And the days of prophecy are not over, in my opinion. I'm going to be talking mainly about Isaiah and Jeremiah here, but there are prophets after them. I was going to, in fact, show you a picture of Daniel, Daniel's vision, and I want to say something about Daniel also. And in the last chapter of my book, I treat Jesus as a prophet, a great Jewish prophet. And so we can talk about that as well. This is not just a question of what would Isaiah do or Jeremiah do, it's also a question of what would Jesus do. So let me begin by saying that when we talk about prophets, I guess in part because they're in the Bible and because there is a tendency to sort of to genuflect before all of the figures in the Bible, there is not so much understanding that prophecy itself is a phenomenon that evolves. That the older prophets, the middle prophets, the later prophets they're not the same. They're not all doing the same thing, they're not all talking about the same thing. And the fact that prophecy actually evolved is, I think, a fascinating issue and a key to understanding what they are all about and what they meant. Prophet, in the ancient Middle East, a prophet, was a profession. And prophets were organized in leagues, unions, if you like, of prophecy. It seems to have been, in many cases, a hereditary role. It was handed down from father to son, and in some rare instances, from mother to daughter. And the prophets played different roles at different times. But one of the things they were expected to do was to advise the ruler. So that kind of some of the earliest examples of prophecy that we see that are mentioned by historians as well as in the Bible are the court prophets, who sound in some ways very much like advisors to a modern ruler. These were people who were expected to advise the leader on practical matters. Should he go to war? Should he seek peace? That sort of thing. And to do that, they also had to keep in mind that things change, that the ruler exists in history, that the people exist in history, that history itself evolves, and therefore they would attempt to look as far as possible into the future in advising the ruler. It's very interesting also in Judaism that divination is contrary to Jewish law. You're not allowed to practice witchcraft, or in the sense of, or magic. The prophets, in some ways, are on the borderline between magical and practical figures, because they are advising the ruler, and they're peering into the future, but they're not looking at the entrails of animals and trying to predict the future the way so-called pagan peoples were doing. So what were they doing? Well, they were trying to understand history and how it moves, but this is, I think, the most fascinating thing. they were perceiving a connection between the ethical universe and the historical universe. They were perceiving that it mattered the way the ruler behaved, the way the society was being conducted, the issue of whether, say, vulnerable people in the society were being taken care of or ignored, wasn't just what we would call a kind of separate ethical question, what many of us would call a separate ethical question, but it was rather linked with the destiny and future of the people. It was linked with their security. Because a fundamental prophetic insight is that if a kingdom is divided, if, as Isaiah said, the landed people are swallowing up all the land and nobody else has any land. If the community is divided, if idolatry is being practiced, I'm going to come back to that in a second, if the moral fiber of the people is being weakened, if they lost sight of their mission in the world, then there's going to be trouble. There's a practical consequence to unbridled power. There's a practical consequence to institutionalized selfishness. And the way that the prophets tended to put it was the people would be punished for their sins. So let me talk a little bit about how this kind of some of these basic concepts evolve, and then we'll get to modern applications. First pictures I was going to show you were pictures of Elijah on Mount Carmel. Right? The earliest stage of prophecy, which historians date to about the 9th century before the Common Era, 9th century BC, involves really one of the first figures who is more than a court advisor, who in fact is a thorn in the side of the ruler. The ruler at the time is King Ahab, whose wife is Jezebel. And Jezebel is a Tyrian princess. She's from Tyre. When Ahab married her, he was conducting himself in a way that was typical of people in the countries of small states that made up what's now we call the Middle East. Right? Many, many small states. And the rulers of those states would try to advance the interests of their people, among other ways, by making treaties. They made wars and they made treaties. They linked themselves with other royal families through marriage, and they increased their influence by doing that. When Ahab married Jezebel, he opened the door to the city of Tyre, which was the most important trading city in the western Mediterranean, northeastern Mediterranean, a fabulously wealthy trading city, and made it possible to expand the influence of his kingdom. The kingdoms that we're talking about at this time are two, of course. If we're looking at the Old Testament, they're Israel, the northern kingdom, and Judah, the southern kingdom. Israel was basically on what we call now Samaria. Judah, in the south, was the kingdom in which the Solomon and David's capital, Jerusalem, was the dominant city. So to make a long story short, there is a drought, a terrible drought. It's one of the great curses of life in that part of the world. And Elijah turns up at court to tell tell the king that the drought is going to continue until he gets his act together, and defends the religious purity, if you like, of the people of Israel. Since Ahab is acting like pretty much any other king in the region, one of the things he does when he marries Jezebel is to tell her, of course, she's free to worship her own gods in her own sanctuary. And so there are temples built to Baal in Israel, and some people are worshiping Yahweh, some people are worshiping Baal. It's sort of live and let live. And there's evidence, by the way, from this period in Jewish history that the common people weren't so sure of whether Yahweh was the only God. And there are archaeological finds. Some of the most fascinating finds are figures of Yahweh, figures of a male god, which was identified as Yahweh, and Asherah, his wife. It was very common in the Middle East at this time for people to worship male and female deities. So we have Elijah appearing to tell the king that if this doesn't stop, and in other words, if the Israelites are just going to become another Canaanite people, worshiping male and female gods and worshiping anything they please, and having little shrines to different gods all over the place and so forth, then that people's national identity will cease to exist, but also whatever kind of special mission they've been blessed with will also cease to exist. They will just become another Middle Eastern people. And so not only does he threaten that the drought will continue until this stops, but also he challenges the priests of Baal to a contest. And the contest, you'll all remember, is on Mount Carmel. Elijah builds an altar, and he actually pours water or some liquid on the altar. The priests of Baal build their altar, and as was their habit, they mutilate themselves and dance around and so forth, to try to get their god to light the sacrifice on their altar. It doesn't work. Whether because a great thunderstorm, which then appeared, happens, and there's a lightning strike, or whether it wasn't water that Elijah poured, but some other chemical, or whether God decided the issue himself, Elijah's sacrifice burns. And let me say that that's sort of the end of the story, at least as I was told it as a kid in my Jewish education program. That's not the end of the story. The end of the story is after Yahweh lights the sacrifice, Elijah's sacrifice is shown to be the true sacrifice, and he cries out to the crowd, Yahweh's coming. He then orders the massacre of the Baalist prophets. And the crowd descends on the prophets of Baal and murders them all. So this is where prophecy starts. This is where prophecy starts. One can see in this kind of prophecy some elements of later prophecy. You can see, for example, a very strong emphasis on a hatred for competing gods. And by the way, you might want to notice here that Elijah at no point does Elijah say Baal is not a god. he says Yahweh is the most powerful God, is the best God, the high God. But there's really no denial yet at this point that there are other gods. And so, right, it's okay. Second thing that you'll see is that he's, instead of being a court prophet, he speaks the truth as he sees it to the court, and ends up in a very, very horrifying way condemning King Ahab and Jezebel to a terrible death, which befalls them, which eventually befalls them after they commit some more sins. So he stands apart from the court. He's trying to speak truth to power as he sees it. But shall I say, this is prophecy in its most nationalistic phase. This is a prophecy which is kind of dominated by feelings about the need to keep the religion pure. And it's dominated by competition with other peoples. And a willingness to sacrifice and, if necessary, kill other peoples in order to secure the virtue and the security of the Israelite people. 1 century later, prophecy changes in some ways completely. Because a century later, something new has happened in the world. And that is, this region of small competitive states, each with its own god, and competing gods, and the whole question of whose god is going to be stronger, and so forth, gives way to a phenomenon which is still with us, the phenomenon of world empire. The next picture I would have shown you is a map of the world which shows an enormous stretch of territory, really ranging almost from India to Europe, dominated by what was going to be then a series of great empires. The first, and in some ways the toughest, was the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians not only were advanced in terms of their military power, they were also coming out of Mesopotamia, which was really that was the big city. That was the most advanced culture also in West Asia, in that part of the world. And they had developed the Assyrians' ways of conquest, which changed the face of warfare completely. I won't bore you with the details, but in the old days, one of the reasons empires weren't that successful is that people would barricade themselves in cities and undergo sieges. And if they were well defended, they would go for years, decades, even under siege and still be able to make it. The Assyrians developed means of overcoming siege defenses, both military means and political means of overcoming siege defenses. They used their superior economic and cultural power as well as their military power to convince people that it didn't make sense to oppose them, at least for a while, they would make allies of them. And then, if people didn't agree to come over to their side, or if they rebelled, they did something which was new in world history. They depopulated countries. They took entire populations into exile, brought them into the Syrian Empire, divided them so that they wouldn't even be able to live in the same place, and watched their enemies, ethnic enemies, disappear. It was a form of genocide, in that it was intended to make an entire ethnic group disappear. And that, of course, you know as well as I am sure, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, that's what happened to Israel, the kingdom of Israel. The 10 tribes and so forth. They were conquered by the Assyrians. They were disappeared into the Assyrian Empire, and they've never been heard from since. So while that situation was developed, there was a prophet in Judah called Isaiah. He was a court prophet too. He started out being an advisor to the king. He was of a distinguished family. Started well-educated, and all the rest. But in him, prophecy really took on a different kind of character. In the first place, unlike Elijah, whose main focus was on idolatry and religious purity of the Israelites, Isaiah had no trouble with idolatry either. But his main focus was on the ethical behavior or misbehavior of the ruling classes of Judah. And he famously said, I won't bother quoting because I know you know the quotes. He famously said, what are your sacrifices to me? The idea that by sacrificing to the right God in the right way, you would satisfy the requirements of Jehovah was an outrage as far as he was concerned. Because he said, if the most vulnerable, weakest and most vulnerable people in your society are not being taken care of, you're not worshiping God. You can't separate formal religion from ethics. They go together. And furthermore, he said, you've got to start thinking about the world that you live in, which is a world of empires. And this I will read because this is I think this is one of the most wonderful things that happens in still in early prophecy. Isaiah, I'll tell you a quick story. If you go to the British Museum, you'll see all of the Assyrian stuff there that the British looted from Iraq and Iran. And it's just wonderful material. The only better material I know is in the German Museum in Berlin, the East Asian Museum. But anyway, it's marvelous stuff. And when I was there, and I was actually doing research for this book, I was looking at the Assyrian materials, and there is an Assyrian emperor, I forget which one, sitting on his throne, and he's surrounded by seraphs. He's surrounded by winged creatures, two wings or four wings creatures. And it turns out this is the way the Assyrian Empire, the emperor was pictured, was in contact with angels, if you like, in contact with divine beings, being himself empowered by the gods to rule. And that was his glory. This was his glory. So, Isaiah, in the last year of King Uzziah's reign, when the old man lay dying of leprosy in a separate department reserved for those with incurable diseases, went to visit Uzziah, and while there, he had a vision. The vision was of a high throne in the temple, a throne so huge and lofty that the skirts of the gown of the creature on the throne filled the sanctuary. Surrounding them were six-winged creatures of flame, seraphim, who cried out to one another in thunderous voices, "Holy, holy, holy is Yahweh of the hosts. The whole earth is filled with his glory." Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. That same prayer you also said. Immediately, the prophet is stricken with a profound sense of unworthiness. He feels like he's not supposed to be viewing God at all, and he feels like a sinner. touches his lips with a coal and pronounces him cured of his sin, he hears God say, "Whom shall I send? Who will be my messenger?" And he answers, "Here I am." And then a message with a kind of horrible content is given to him. The message is, go and say to the people, hear and hear again, but do not understand. See and see again, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people fat, its ears dull, shut its eyes so that it will not see with its eyes, hear with its ears, understand with its heart, and be converted and healed. This mysterious message is to go and prophesy to people, even though knowing that the prophesying itself will be ineffective, that the people won't understand. People have been talking about it ever since, what it means, what this means ever since. But the first thing I want to note is that the initial vision is a vision of an emperor on his throne, surrounded by seraphim. Clearly, it seems to me, Isaiah, and also the same thing can be said of Jeremiah, and even of Jesus, of subsequent prophets in the age of empire. The prophet is inspired by the existence of an empire which Isaiah says in another passage breaks down all boundaries. The emperor is so powerful, the new order is so dynamic that it breaks down all boundaries. It extends itself to the world, to the known world. And when that happens, the subject, if you like, of the prophet's concern, the subject of God's concern, is not just a particular people, the people of Israel. It's a world. This is the beginning of a world vision, of the idea of a united society. But the problem is that the people who are bringing that society about are power addicts. There are people addicted to violence, who use violence to conquer other peoples and then to smash revolts. The empire was and is a machine for violence because it inevitably produces rebellion against the people who don't want to be ruled against their will. They don't want to lose all their autonomy, so they rebel. It also produces violence because there are imperial competitors. Other people want to be the emperor. And so it's a violence-ridden but unifying world. It's violent globalization, if you want to look at it like that. And Isaiah says, this can't be what God wants. Maybe what God wants is for the world to unify and for these boundaries to be laid low and for people to stop worshiping competing gods. But he doesn't want this done at gunpoint or sword point. So Isaiah's other great insight is that the law of life, the law of politics, international politics has changed. And that to the extent that people's previous worldviews were based on a static idea, things don't change that fast, custom is custom, and so on. Isaiah says, no, things are transformed. God is a transformer, something which does not appear in Elijah at all. God is a transformer. And one of the great symbols of the transformation, which again he picks up from the Assyrian Empire, is iron. Right? Because iron, which is what the weapons are made of, this is the Iron Age. Right? This is the most powerful, most efficient, most effective kind of weaponry you can imagine. It can be melted can be smelted, right, and melted. There would come a time, the prophet proclaimed, when, quote, the mountain of the temple of Yahweh shall tower above the mountains and be lifted higher than the hills, when, quote, all the nations will stream to it, unquote, and when Yahweh himself, or those inspired by him, would adjudicate between many people. And then he says, the same vision, these will hammer their swords into plowshares, their spears into sickles. Nation will not lift sword against nation. There will be no more training for war. So, the iron weapons that dominate the world get transformed into weapons of productive agriculture. And vision now, for the first time, is a vision of peace. Instead of constant warfare, it's a vision of peace. Somehow, the reality of the empire has to be dealt with in such a way that will eventually produce a unified world and a peaceful world. And as I've been telling now for I don't know how many years, my students in conflict resolution classes, that's where the ideas come from. Where do you think these ideas came from? Not from the Enlightenment, although there's some mighty good ideas that came out of the Enlightenment. This is where it came from. All right, let me add a couple of elements to this, and then we can try to do some applying of these lessons. Isaiah warns Hezekiah, the king of Israel, king of Judah, not to take part in an anti-Assyrian alliance, not to play the game, the power game. He says he has reason to believe that Jerusalem will not fall if Hezekiah stays out of his alliance being cooked up by the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Syria against the Assyrians. Isaiah says, stay out of it, and he turns out to have been absolutely right, because the Assyrians do descend on Jerusalem, and then there is what seems to have been a plague, very common, a common occurrence, and the armies would go for long distances away from their home and be struck by new diseases. It still happens. And so Jerusalem was saved. That in some ways turned out to be misleading. Because Assyria then loses control of its empire and is replaced by the next imperial giant, which is Babylonia. Babylonia and its great king and general Nebuchadnezzar take over the Assyrian empire and expand it, and in some ways modernize it, because actually Babylon is a more modern place at this point than Assyria was. And now there is a new prophet in Israel, and I can't deal with him in detail over here all day. He is the so-called weeping prophet, a man who differs in his approach from all preceding prophets in the personalism of his message, in the poetry that he speaks, which is incomparable, but also in the fact that he feels everything so deeply and is so focused on feelings, on the world of feelings and emotions. And that's Jeremiah. Jeremiah, let me say very quickly, Jeremiah, there are 2 or 3 messages that I want to mention, something that he adds to the prophetic tradition. One message is this. He takes up the theme of Isaiah, that you don't go to war, you don't make alliances, you go to war against the most powerful nation and try to become the most powerful nation by giving her the most powerful alliance. On the contrary, and this is where he goes beyond Isaiah, if Babylon is now the world's most powerful country, and if Nebuchadnezzar Nebuchadnezzar is threatening Israel. The kingdom of Israel has disappeared now because of the Assyrians, so he's threatening Judah. There must be some reason for that, Jeremiah says. And he says the reason is that the people have lost sight of their mission to try to bring the united, peaceful world into existence. They've lost sight of their mission to create economic equality, more economic equality and social equality, and take care of the poor and near poor in their community. They've lost sight of the mission to extend, to speak the word of Jehovah to other peoples. And therefore, Babylon is God's instrument. God wants Babylon. And he wants the Jews to learn from that the search for power is not their destiny. So Jeremiah is immediately in trouble. He's considered a subversive, a traitor, unreliable on security issues. And people ask him, well, but what do you want from us? I mean, this is the way the world works. The power, the big fish eat up the small fish. What are you going to do about that? What do you have to say about that? His answer is, yes, that's what happens until people change. And when he's asked, well, what do you mean people change? He says, the change that I'm looking for takes place in the heart. When people change, people start to feel each other's feelings. People start to identify with each other as humans. People stop the practice of idolatry of the state. Then everything will change. And not only that, he projects into the future. Then he looks into the future and he says, I foresee a time coming when I'm not going to have to teach that because you'll know it already. People will give the law. The way he puts it is he says the law will be written in people's hearts. They won't have to be taught. He's looking for a personal transformation, collective, as well as personal transformation, which will turn everything around, which will turn history around. An interesting thing for us now is to think about what that means today. And I have one more thing to say before I get to that, but before I get to the present. But on the one hand, you could look at that and say, well, this is utopian nonsense, right? I mean, this is an old, it's not an old con. You know, yes, we hope everybody will change. You know, the people are people, they don't change. But as a historian, I have to tell you, there's actually truth in this as part of a historical process. Take a look at a book if you want to follow this up. There's some wonderful books about what brought about the French Revolution and what brought about the revolutions of the 19th century, the 18th and 19th century that produced the kind of democratic societies that we know that exist still. And one of the things that happens is an enormous collective emotional change to people. Some writers have even linked this with the growth of literature. That a newly literate people, common people, reading novels and reading stories about other people who they didn't know before, discover that those people are like them. And the people they had formerly written off for stereotypes, the other, inferiors, or dangerous people, turns out we don't think about them like that. A emotional and combined emotional intellectual change is taking place in people's consciousness. So when you hear people say, people never change, well, they're not reading history. They don't read history. Because people do change from age to age. Sometimes for the worse, maybe. But they do change. And Jeremiah saw that. Jeremiah saw that. So that in the third and last stage of the evolution of prophecy, the last stage I'm going to talk about right now, Babylon conquers Israel. Jerusalem is leveled. The temple is destroyed. Most of the people in the country are taken into exile in Babylon, although not an Assyrian style exile, an exile where they're permitted to live together and they become thriving community, actually, in Babylon. And a new prophet appears after this happens, who's also called Isaiah. If you read the book of Isaiah, somewhere around chapter 50, you may realize you may be reading a different guy. He's still, for various reasons, being called Isaiah. But he's talking about things that the earlier Isaiah couldn't have known happened. And he's clearly coming out of this later period where the Babylonian conquest is taking place. The Jews are in Babylon, and a new figure is on the horizon, a new empire, and a new emperor is on the horizon. The new empire is Persian, and the new emperor is Cyrus. Cyrus is a new, if you like, the first, in some ways, beneficent empire is taking place. And so this new Isaiah, which people would call him Isaiah of Babylon, the scholars call him Isaiah of Babylon. Isaiah begins his prophecy by saying, "Comfort ye my people, comfort ye," and then announces, and what I'm calling now the last stage of at least the early prophetic development. Now he totally embraces the idea that the world politically should be in unity. That there should be a kingdom, if you like, called the kingdom of God, and in which the ethical rules of Judaism are accepted on a global basis, but it is not ruled by an emperor at sword point. It's not ruled by force. It's consented to. People accept it because they accept it, not because they're compelled to accept it. And in this world, he says, this is another first. For the first time, he says, these other gods, they're really not gods. Isaiah of Babylon is the first of the prophets to say, these are fictions. He also, interestingly, says they're not demons either. That's a later development where later Judaism and Christianity decided that the old gods, some of them were demons. He just said, Isaiah of Babylon says they just don't exist. There's only one God. There's only one. And then he pictures God as the creator, as there's a wonderful passage, if I can find it quickly. In a breathtaking act of imagination, the poet, Isaiah, pictures God in space, looking down from a great distance on his handiwork. He lives above the circle of the earth. Its inhabitants look like grasshoppers. This guy never flew in a plane. He has stretched out the heavens like a cloth, spread them for a tent for men to live in, and then he delivers the punchline. He reduces princes to nothing. He annihilates the rulers of the world. This is the vision, which is then followed by the second Isaiah, by the servant's song. There's some evidence, at least a lot of scholars think, that the song was written basically by one of his disciples later on about him. That Isaiah of Babylon, who seems to have had some childhood disease or something that left him looking bad, perhaps leprosy or smallpox or something, and who, at the time that Cyrus the Great was extending his rule over the whole world as the Persians, Isaiah of Babylon is still in Babylon telling the Babylonian rulers, you're finished. Cyrus the Great, he says, is God's instrument. In fact, he calls him the Messiah. He's trying to let all of the people, the Jews and everybody else, all the captured people go home. It's a new world that Cyrus has created. And the Babylonians don't want to hear that. I mean, it's treasonous. As far as they're concerned, it's treasonous. So they seem to have killed him. They seem to have tortured and killed him. And in the servant song, which has been, as you know, and probably interpreted by Christians as a foretelling of Jesus' passion and so on, he is completely, he becomes identified with the people. And in a sense, he dies for them. He dies for them, not shall I say, not to redeem some debt in kind of medieval atonement terms, but because he stands for them. He stands in for them. He represents them. He's always represented. So he dies for them, and he never gets to see the payoff, which is that Cyrus the Great becomes the ruler of the world and then lets everybody go home. But he does understand, and this is my last word on this, he does understand that as long as there's empire, you can't count on people like Cyrus to be running it. And he prophesies, before he's killed, he prophesies that the Persian Empire will also be overthrown, and the Persian Empire is not the last empire, God's empire is the last. Because it still will be forced to rely on force. And sure enough, Cyrus dies, his son is Darius. Darius decides to extend the empire into Europe. And Darius and his son operate the most brutal empire ever seen. A terrifically violent empire, which finally is overthrown by Alexander the Great. And when Alexander the Great becomes emperor of the world, then the Jews have to figure out, when does this end? We have prophets promising us that this is going to be the end of empire, and there will be a new kind of political, peaceful, just political universe. And that's what God wants. When do we get it? And that's the question we're still asking. Jesus had an answer to the question. Muhammad tried to have an answer to the question. Karl Marx had an answer to the question. Other modern prophets. But what sticks with us, at least what sticks with me, is that the way they define the mission, which I think is the mission of Jews and Christians and Muslims and others, and non-believers, the mission is to create that world. It's to undergo the kind of political and personal changes necessary to bring a peaceful, unified world into existence. Isn't that? It's obvious. And nothing else will work. And yet we're still waiting. I think the prophets say, how long? How long? And the answer, Jeremiah's answer is still good than Isaiah's answer. It's up to you. One thing we can certainly say about our world today, couldn't in the old days is that there is the technical, economic, technological capacity to create that good world. Like you might have said, never really existed before. Not many people were stuck in each in their own corner of the world with their own occupation and their own little economic, the limitations of the ancient economy. Those limitations are falling away, and we're still stuck. We're stuck in a bad situation. The Middle East now, I think, probably represents exactly how stuck we are. And it's something we can talk about, and I would keep keeping you too long, but I just keep talking. So I think maybe the best thing to do is for me to stop this lecturing piece of it, and for us to discuss we can discuss Middle Eastern policy if you like, or we can discuss what you think about the message and how you would apply it to modern conditions, modern foreign policy issues. I have to say that I am in mourning for the people of Gaza, and I don't know what I do not know what the result of this should be. How to make it better, what to do now. I have a vision of my own, and which is shared by many other people, about what the peace of the Middle East would look like. It's based on the prophetic vision. It's based on let me give you one more quote before I shut up. Isaiah, at one point, I'll do this for them. Isaiah, at one point, is challenged as being insufficiently patriotic or not nationalistic enough for his people he's talking, because he's talking about this new world. And he says, this is first Isaiah. He says, I've seen into the future. I've seen a vision. What's the vision? He says, one day there will be a road, a great road, and it will lead from Assyria to Israel, Judah, to Egypt. One road. And God will see that road and bless it, and he will say, blessed be the Assyrians, my work, my handiwork. The Egyptians, my people. Israel, my heritage. And Isaiah already saw the possibility of a world of equal nations respecting each other. No favor, God not playing favor. So the wonderful thing about that amazing statement is he doesn't say, my chosen people, the Jews. He says basically they're all chosen. So, so when I think about the Middle East, I think about the Israel that Martin Luther, a modern prophet, Martin Luther, envisaged, along with Hannah Arendt and Edward Said and a number of other people. That was a vision of a nation, a region, and a nation in which all people's integrity and communal existence and communal customs would be observed, and it would not be a Jewish state or a Muslim state or an anybody's state. It would be a state dedicated to equal treatment of all the major peoples. the slogan that Judah Magnus, the president at one time of Hebrew University, said was, what Magnus said was, one state for many peoples. And some of his followers talked about confederation. So that is a state that would incorporate the interests of each of these groups. In some ways, like Lebanon does, but better. So I think that's the way I think. And that the prophets would approve, and that's where we have to get. Right? How we get there, I don't know. So that's enough for me. What do you think?
So can I ask the question I mentioned to you?
Yes.
So I imagine Isaiah going to the rulers of Israel today and saying, "Thus saith the Lord, bring peace, make war no more." And I can imagine the rulers of Israel to say, yes, Isaiah said that, but there was a first prophet, a greater prophet. His name was Abraham. And Abraham said, "Thus saith the Lord, the holy land of Israel, from the river to the sea is yours. And expel all people from that land." And this would be used to defend what they're doing in Gaza, which I think is genocide. We kind of brush past that subject. So my question is, we have almost like the trial of Elijah, which prophet is right? In this case, it's Abraham and the promise of the land, or Isaiah and universal peace. How would you address that dilemma?
Easy. Isaiah's right. Unless you believe in, I don't know, biblical inerrancy and everything that's said in the Bible is of equal value with everything else, which I don't. Then it seems to me you kind of life forces you to choose between messages. I mean, there's a message, the most horrifying section of the Bible is in the book of Kings, and the book of Joshua, and also Kings, with describing the destruction of the Canaanites. Interestingly, the scholars now think it's probably inaccurate. That is, they don't think that this is actually burning all of the cities to the ground and killing women and children and so forth, as Joshua was told he could do, he ought to do. And from it's still references to the far-right religious people in Israel. Some of them still talk about the Amalekites and how God told the Jews, kill all the Amalekites, even the women and the children. Well, they don't seem to have actually done that. They seem to have intermarried, which for other reasons the religious figures might not recognize how it happens very frequently in history. The historians love to tell war stories about how one people conquered another. They don't tell, for example, if you look at Chinese history, the way the Chinese had basically absorbed everybody who tried to invade them, not militarily, through marriage and cultural influence. So that seems to have happened even in ancient Israel. And so people then tell these stories for reasons of their own. I mean, they tell the stories of these bloody stories, especially to express a situation in which people feel existentially threatened. And I think basically that's what we have in Israel. We have the people who are the descendants of, in some cases, even survivors few cases, survivors of the Holocaust. The Holocaust really happened. The Holocaust was, in some ways, the worst massacre in history. And worse not only in numerical terms, but just in terms of the way it was done, motivations and so on. And even as a Jew, I still feel threatened by it. I can certainly understand how people attacked as the Israelis were on October 7th and 23 might think that it was the Holocaust happening all over again. There, I have my own guru who is not a prophet, but a scholar from the University of Virginia originally, who used to run an institution called the Center for Mind and Human Interaction. His name is Amik Khan. He's still with us, although he's even older than I am. And his great book about ethnic conflict talks about the traumatization of peoples, whole peoples, and how if you're put through an experience that's bad enough, dangerous and horrifying enough for your whole people, you become traumatized, individuals become traumatized, and they pass the trauma along with their stories, transgeneration to generation. Part of the characteristics of trauma, as you know if you've ever been in a car accident, is that you think it's happening again, even when it's not. That's so horrifying that anything that reminds you of it convinces you it's all happening again. And so Freud, who invented the whole idea, Freud said the traumatized person lives in the past. And the therapist needs to somehow get them out of the past and help them to understand that even though dangerous things are happening in the present, it's not the same as what happened to them. But I think a whole people traumatized. And elements of that people, leadership elements, but also elements of the population, who simply were seek revenge. And so the kind of combination of traumatized mentality plus revenge seeking produces this abomination, which is the attack on the children in Gaza.
That, in fact, is why I have such a problem with what's happening in Gaza. Because I would personally expect that people who had survived within recent memory the trauma of the Holocaust would approach with nothing but sympathy, rather than scream.
That's a naive idea. If you don't mind me saying so, that's a very naive idea. People who have been subject to that kind of violence don't just bounce back and say, oh, now that I've experienced that, I'll sympathize with
But then they learn nothing from the experience.
No, I think, the learning is painful and it takes time. And it certainly hasn't been forwarded, it hasn't been helped by what Israel is doing. But it doesn't, it's harder than you're suggesting, I think. It's harder. But listen, I want to add something else before we get totally lost. What's the prophetic message? The prophetic message is not what Israel is doing so bad, that Israel is doing so bad. It's that what empires do so bad. Would there be an Israel if there weren't an American empire? In its current shape? And the fact that Israel does America's bidding, has done it since 1948, and it's viewed by other people in the region as American stooge, American agent, has deprived that state of legitimacy in its own region since the very beginning. Why? Because the same people who were subject to British and French imperialism, who were betrayed after World War I, after they were told they were all going to get their independence, and none of them did, except the Saudis. See America as the, which is perfectly clear it is, I think, in my view. America is the successor to England, in particular in Palestine. And it's the successor to France and Syria and Lebanon. That's how it's viewed. And to talk about people who learned that, what did the Americans learn from this? Now with their Abraham Accords and so forth, they're like, oh, we'll get the Saudis, let's see, on the Iranians, we'll have the Israelis on the Syrians and Lebanese. Now we'll have peace of a kind, the peace of the gunpoint or bomb point. And now we'll have an alliance with the Saudis and the other conservative Sunni nations, and somehow there's something in Gaza, maybe between Gaza and the Trump resort. But it's not clear, but there's no plan for Gaza. But what there is a plan for is a continued American domination of the region. Where the new empire? That shouldn't be, I don't think that's debatable. The last picture I was going to show you, if I have my pictures, is U.S. military bases. And it's 750 bases in 150 countries. Including in the Middle East, of course. Military stuff all over the place. So if we're going to be prophetic about it, we still have to talk about ending the system of empire, don't we? Anyway, go ahead.
It sounds like you're suggesting that the two-state solution, which has recently been floated again by France, and I think has some people think that it's probably going to be impossible because the U.S. won't allow it.
Probably.
But if by some miracle this could actually begin to go forward, what do you think the chances for it would be? Like if America would just get out of the way?
I think so much of it really depends on what you mean by the state.
Right.
If I think that one could fantasize a state which is a real state, which has autonomous decision-making and has its own army or police force and its own foreign policy and its own trade policy and all of that, that's the state. That ain't gonna happen. That's simply not gonna happen. I'm sorry to say. I would love it. I think if it could happen, it might be indeed the solution. But what you're more likely to get is something called a state, in which the dominant powers in the region decide who's politically acceptable and who's not, whether there's an army or a police force or not, whether there's a foreign policy, what the content of the foreign policy is, and trade policy. I don't see Israelis having a Palestinian state that becomes a competitor. And I think that's one reason the Israelis themselves have kind of stopped even the peace movement in Israel, stopped talking very much about it. It seems to me also that the problem is the Jewish state, is the Israeli state, does it remain a Jewish state? And if so, what does that mean? Does it mean a continuation of the current treatment of Palestinians wherever they live, including Israel? Does it mean Jewish supremacy in the sense that it currently does? So I'm not sure what the answer to any of that is, but I think if that stays the same, then really nothing changes.
forgiveness and justice are not the same thing. Sometimes they fight each other. Sometimes you have some systems prioritize one over the other. I think Christians, we prioritize forgiveness and love over everything else, which means we degrade justice. And to some people, that's immoral. To forgive someone who should not be forgiven is unjust.
Yeah.
And so I guess my question is, when you have, what do you feel in Israel today is sort of the ethical presupposition? Is it because we have an intractable blood feud? We have people who have killed family members, friends, colleagues, people in the same nation. Is it moral to forgive? Is it moral, of course, in a contemporary Israeli perspective? We just need to win. We just need to win and drive out everybody else. And that is how we declare justice. Because I'm just wondering are we just projecting Christian ethics onto other religious systems and other ethical systems and nations?
That's a really great question, and I don't think but I wanted to tell you, I'm looking at my phone because I'll look at my computer after this. I'm in a theological book club, and they just read a wonderful book about forgiveness, in which there's a critique by a Christian theologian of some traditional ideas about forgiveness. And one of the things he says in this, I wish I could remember his, I can't remember his name, I'll give it to you afterwards if you haven't read it yet. One of the things he says is that forgiveness can't mean not being angry. Forgiveness can't mean not seeking compensation or even sometimes seeking punishment. So how forgiveness happens, who forgives whom in this kind of situation is hairy. And I think most people now who are thinking about it, people in my field, conflict resolution, are thinking about it, pretending these days to say forgiveness comes with don't raise your expectations. And forgiveness is going to happen right away. People have to work through so much grief, so much anger, so much need for closure and all of the rest before they get there. And it's not sometimes unrealistic to expect it to happen. And I see that, I see that. But I guess I have to say that I think there are simply some unanswered questions. Lots of unanswered questions, but one in particular that your question raises is if you talk about October 7th and the horrors of that, and really inexcusable violence. I think it's inexcusable. On the one hand, it's inexcusable. Because so much pain was done to innocent people. On the other hand, it's also understandable that people who are as oppressed as the Palestinians would at some point rebel. I sometimes wonder if no civilians had been attacked on the 7th, if there hadn't been women raped, and there hadn't been all the people on the kibbutz being attacked, if they had just attacked the army bases and killed Israeli soldiers, would everybody thought that was okay? Right? Clearly the Israelis wouldn't. I'm not sure I would either. I mean, death is death, whether the person's in uniform or not. But it would have removed one of the main sources of mobilization, desire for counter-violence, and desire for revenge, maybe. So the question that I think is unanswered such a way that they understand that they share some responsibility. That's what I don't see happening in all industry, even among most of my peace-oriented friends there. And I think it's hard to make it happen, to get it. It's like after 9/11 here, I got in a lot of trouble after 9/11. I went on NBC Morning News. Never have done it. The day after 9/11. Too early to talk in any way except shedding tears. That's the only thing I would do. Anyway. And I didn't say hardly anything at all. I mean, I didn't say very much. But I had some guy, news guy, interviewed me and said, well, I read a book on terrorism. So you're supposed to be an expert on terrorism. How can you explain such a horrible, inhumane, and god-awful thing that's happened? And I said, well, I can't, there's no doubt that it's horrible, inhumane, and god-awful. And it's inexcusable. I said, but look at American foreign policy in the region for the past X number of decades. And that will give you some ideas about why people hate us out there. I think that's all I said. And by the time I got home, the phone was ringing off. The first call was from President George Mason University, who said, Rich, I want you to know you still have a job. Because I was way too quick about trying to talk about shared responsibility. But really, I think that's the bottom line in some ways. It's not, you don't want to take sides. You think about the people that Gaza went through for 15 years before 2023, 17 years of blockade. Right there, my friend Richard Falk called it the world's largest open-air prison. And you didn't expect something bad was going to happen as a result of this? Right? It's I hate to sound like a broken record, but it's the same old story, isn't it? Empire produces violence.